Okay, can you guys hear me okay? All right. We get some feedback. We're trying some new stuff here, mic-wise. So if we get some feedback, just bear with us. Okay, a couple of announcements before we get going. A few of you are interested in adding the class, and I need to sign some overrides, and I said that I'd do that today if that was the case. So I need you to come see me afterwards, and it's kind of first come. Not like trample each other. Like I have identified those individuals that came up to me on Monday, and so I kind of know the sequence of the line. And I only have 4 seats. Okay, so I'm going to only sign 4 sheets today. Otherwise, we're in a fire hazard situation because we don't have anybody sitting. We can't have anybody sitting on the floor, blocking the aisle, or anything like that. Okay? Second announcement. Many of you have tried the Connect and have been successful. A few have tried and have been not successful. So there is a 1-800 number code on or 1-800 number phone number. The code is use the phone. The 1-800 number, if you want to write it down, 800-331-5094. And if you call them, a lot of times they can help troubleshoot through the issues that you're having. Okay? I do my best to get caught up on my emails, but sometimes I fall about a day behind. So I will respond to you, but if it's an emergency, it's just a matter of when I actually get to my email. Okay. Second thing, on the textbook, many of you have ordered the textbook and have told me that it's going to be 2 weeks until it gets here. If you go into the BB Learn shell and you go to the Connect assignments and you click on the first worksheet, it'll take you into the Connect that's linked to this class. And then from there, you could register for a 2-week free trial. And they actually give you the full Cadillac version. They give you the ebook, they give you Connect access, and it's linked to this class. Then when your code arrives, or if you decide to just do that for 2 weeks and let it expire, if you've ever downloaded freeware that's free for 30 days, and then it gives you that notification, then you just enter your code at that time. Okay? And it'll save all your assignments, and it still keeps it connected to this class. But more importantly, you're not going 2 or 3 weeks without a textbook. You get access to the ebook in the interim. You don't have to buy the Cadillac version, but they're going to try to entice you with it, of course. Right? All right, second thing. I have put a textbook on reserve in the library. It's under Course Reserve. You can check it out for a 4-hour period of time. It has to stay in the library. But if you need to bridge that time before financial aid kicks in or Uncle Jack sends a check, you've got a couple of options available to you so you're not waiting around for a textbook to miraculously appear. Okay? If that textbook is getting used a lot, which would make me happy, then I'll put another one over there. Okay? So, those are some resources available to you guys. Any questions on that? Alright, so we don't have class on Monday, but I'll see you in a week. So, just remember that. If you come here, use the time and study, I guess. I'm not sure you'll be able to get in the room. It's like under all these electronic blocks, but I'll see you next Wednesday. So it sounds weird, but have a nice weekend. This Wednesday. This is where we left off, so we're going to dive right into it. And we're first going to talk about homeostasis. So homeostasis helps to maintain a stable condition. That doesn't mean that nothing changes. It doesn't mean that it's unchanging or unwavering. It just means that it's a stable condition, meaning that it's going to fluctuate, but it's fluctuating about a set point. So it's not static, and we maintain it by what we call feedback loops. And there's 2 types that we're going to talk about. There's a negative feedback loop, and there's a positive feedback loop. Now, why did I say negative first? It's much more common. Most of the feedback loops in general in our body, physiologically, are negative feedback loops. So there's a couple of examples sitting over here on this slide, up top. On the top right, you can see this thermostat exercise, or thermostat example, rather. And so let's walk through this. All of you probably are familiar with the thermostat, you know how it works, right? It's that magic little box on the wall that you push the button, or you turn the dial. Or have you guys heard of these new remotely operated? Like there's a company called Nest that makes these remotely operated. So we're in the process of upgrading, and I can turn my furnace on from this lecture hall, which is kind of weird, but kind of cool. But they all have even the fancy Nest technology that is a Wi-Fi connection, and you can actually be driving back from Phoenix, and you set it at 58 degrees when you left, and then you want to show up and it be nice and 70 or 72. You can do it from Munns Park. By the time you get home, it's nice and toasty. But the way that it works, even though it sounds really cool and sexy, is very straightforward. Right? You've got a room temperature that falls to 67 degrees Fahrenheit. So the thermostat is triggered because it's set at a set point of 68. You can see down here the set point is 68. So at 68 degrees, when it falls below that, like to 66, then it kicks the thermostat on. That puts out heat, heats it up past 68, most likely. At 68, it shuts it off, but the blower keeps going, and it heats it up a little bit to 70, and then it's completely off, and then the room cools down. And so over time, you kind of have this waveform. This is a classic example of a negative feedback loop. All right, so we're going to do another one. And in order to do this in a classroom of 400, we have to be very careful. So if you have any physical limitations or you're not feeling well today, you don't have to participate. But everybody else will stand up. Okay. Everybody know how to take your pulse? Okay, so we're going to take our resting pulse, and you're going to write this number down. Okay, you ready? Go. Stop. Okay, write that number down. Multiply it by 4. You can use your phone if you need to. So that was your resting pulse. Now it's not completely, it's resting for this activity. That's our control. Stand back up, because you're going to do something here in a standing position. So the standing resting pulse is the most relevant. Yeah, there's tons of room here to do this activity. I know. You guys ready for this? If you have high heels on, you probably don't want to participate. Okay? Now some gentlemen sat down. Okay. All right, so now we're actually going to exercise for a period of time, for about 45 minutes. I'm just kidding. And then we're going to take our exercising pulse. Are you guys ready for that? And I have my PT whistle. I thought about wearing my bike shorts, but I thought that'd be a little awkward with a tie. Come on, let me see him. Look at that. You have to stay in place, but I get to move around. You guys look good. You guys are fit. How many of you are exercise science majors? Look at those. They can raise their hand and run. Now keep going. Come on, this is exercise. How long are we going to do this? Until somebody gives up, soldier. You guys ready? Couple more. High knees, come on. Stop. Write that number down. Multiply by 2. Because it's a bigger number. I didn't want to confuse some of you. Multiplying a larger number by 4 would be complicated. Okay, you have those numbers? This is actually pretty cool because this is like an N of 404. It's pretty cool. So we can actually compile all this data, create an average, standard deviation. But instead of doing that, we're going to do it a little bit more, less scientifically. I want to hear some examples of your resting heart rate. Just shout them out. 84. Wait. Like one at a time. Not ready, set, go. Okay. 84. 88. 108. You must be a little nervous. All right. 60. Ooh, someone's 60. Anybody below 60? 56. Anybody beat 56? 56? Both of you are 56 and you're sitting next to each other? You guys like twinsies or? Anybody lower than 56? 52. Wow. Standing. That's not even supine. That's not even lying down. What about anybody higher than 108? Resting. 112. Okay. Too many Red Bulls back there. 108, 112. 108 again. Okay. That can make some people nervous, I guess. It was the bike shorts comment, wasn't it? Okay, so we've got like 52 to 108, 112. 100 to 112, right? That would be considered our resting for this activity. Now let's hear, so that's not super scientific, I get that, but we have all the data. You wrote it down. We could collect it, burn the entire class period, and you guys would be excited about that. But I think you get the idea. We have between 50 and 100, or 52 and 112 is our resting heart rate. Now what about our exercise-induced heart rate? I'm really glad at 404, nobody fell over. Nobody had any major health problems. What were some of our exercise rates? 126. 100. 94. 92. 132. 106. Anything else? 92. What about the other 400 of you? 108, 120. I see a trend. You guys see a trend that most of them are above 100? Okay. All right, let's do, so have those numbers. You've got 50, let's say our average between 52 and 112 is like 77. And let's say our average of exercise is going to be like 110. 75 to 110. You've had a cool down period. Let's go ahead and take our pulse again. Ready? Sorry, I need my prop. One second. Stop. Multiply by 4. Okay, 75 average at a 110 average. What is your expectation if this is a negative feedback loop? What do you think the numbers are going to look like?
About 75.
Lower. What are they? Let's hear them. 56, 72, 112. What? 60. 104. 76. Anything else? So now we've got our 75. We went up to about a 110. Now we're back down. It looks like we're probably in the 80s on average. We're not quite there yet. You guys trained, and we did this every class period. By the end of the semester, it would be a lot more predictable. Okay? Some of us it takes longer to recover. Others recover very quickly. But that's pretty representative. In 400 students, right, we're seeing one side of this feedback loop. Right? Up and then back down. So, heart rate is an example of a negative feedback regulated system. That's what we just did. By definition, this is our activity. What is a negative feedback loop? Well, a negative feedback loop is one in which the response to the stimulus or the problem is in actually the opposite direction. Right? So in the temperature example of the room, if the room cools off, the response is to heat it up. Okay, so negative feedback systems usually shut down or turn off as a result of a trigger. What are some other systems? We said it's the most common. What are some other systems, physiologically speaking, in the body that you know would be negative feedback? Okay, a sweating response, which would be temperature regulation within the body.
Brain chemicals?
Brain chemicals, many of them are. Some of them are actually heightened as a result, but that's more rare.
Blood sugar levels?
Blood sugar levels, that's a great example. So let's dwell on that for a second. Blood sugar levels. If blood sugar levels fall, the response is to increase sugar levels. If sugar levels rise, the response is to decrease sugar levels, to try to maintain it around a homeostatic set point. An inflammatory response. So if it's done normally, yes. So an inflammatory response is going to be under a negative feedback loop. Where it becomes a problem in a disease state is when it's chronic and it's heightened and it becomes what we say is a positive feedback loop, which is some of the examples neurophysiologically in the brain. What else? There's a lot more. Adrenaline. Okay, what else?
The reproductive system?
The reproductive system, depending on which part, some parts are negative feedback. Many are actually positive. We'll talk about a few of them in a second.
Respiratory?
Respiratory, be more specific.
Oxygen levels?
Oxygen levels, I would agree.
Hormone levels?
Hormone levels, some are positive. We'll talk about those. They go along with reproduction, but many of them are negative.
Cholesterol?
Cholesterol levels. How about something other than temperature, but in the same similar category?
pH level?
pH levels, very good. pH levels. Okay, so if we look at this list, we have temperature, we have hormonal levels, we have pH, we just did heart rate. Nobody said blood pressure. We had oxygenation, and that goes along the lines of like ionic balance. We said glucose, but ionic balance like sodium, potassium, chloride, all of those examples as well are under these negative feedback loops. And if sodium's too high, you'll actually excrete it in the urine. If sodium's too low, then you will retain it, hence retaining water, and you won't get rid of that precious ion.
Is something still considered homeostasis if it happens spontaneously as opposed to being detected and almost purposely corrected?
It's still considered homeostasis if you have a response to a trigger.
Okay.
Yeah, whether it's slow or whether it's fast. Okay? So, for example, the body is primarily controlled by two main systems, the nervous system and the endocrine system. So, neurons, which are very fast acting, and hormones, which are actually much slower responding. Okay? Well, why would you have two examples like that? Both are homeostatic regulators, but for the nervous system, for example, if you touch something that's hot, you don't want to release a hormone that takes a lot of time to get into the bloodstream, circulate around, and then send its message. You want to fire an action potential quick and move your finger. If you're going to want to regulate something that's broad-based, let's say reproduction or hormone levels, let's take, for example, the female 28-day cycle. That's something that's broad over the whole organism, and you want to actually control it in a very methodical manner, but it doesn't have to happen quick and then fade fast. It actually ramps up and then it slows down. So we have two main ways to control it. We have sort of a coarse adjustment knob and we have a fine-tuning adjustment knob. But both examples will be homeostasis.
Could things like hemorrhaging be an example of a lack of homeostasis in the body or the body failing to maintain homeostasis?
Yeah, hemorrhage is an interesting case. Hemorrhage would be aspects of the body are trying to maintain homeostasis because the blood will clot. Blood clotting, though, is an example of a positive feedback loop, not a negative feedback loop, so we haven't quite gotten there. But your example of hemorrhage is actually a good one. Some are negative and some aspects are positive.
Would an allergic reaction be considered a negative feedback loop?
No, allergic reaction is actually a positive feedback loop because it's a hypersensitivity. So you trigger it, and it triggers itself and ramps up. Make sense? So if you are exposed to something like pet dander, or olive trees, or bee pollen, and you're allergic to it, the second time you see it, you're actually heightened as far as your sensitivity. So if you're allergic in a dangerous way to bee stings, or amoxicillin, which is an antibiotic, a drug, or peanuts, the way we know that you're allergic is probably the first time it was pretty bad. And then the doctor said, don't let it happen again, otherwise it actually might kill you. Because that second stimulus will be bigger than the first. So that would be a positive feedback. But that's a nice transition to 2 slides from now when we talk about positive feedback. So let's finish this out. Negative feedback. In a negative feedback loop, I said that the response to the problem states in the opposite direction. Unlike this allergy response that we talked about. So the opposite direction. That means if you're hot, then you're going to try to cool your body off. So you're going to sweat. We had an example of sweating. And you're going to what we call vasodilate. You vasodilate the blood vessels that send blood to the skin. Why?
To get as much heat out as possible.
As much heat from the core, you want to shunt to the extremities, to the skin, and let it escape. It escapes via conduction, right? Just touching something will have heat transfer. A couple of you came up and I shook a few hands, and there was some heat transfer because your hands were like ice cold. Okay, so heat transfer is conduction. There's convective heat loss, meaning that when air moves across it, it takes heat with it. There's evaporative heat loss, which is one of the most effective, meaning that you take warm temperatures, you heat up a liquid, it evaporates off in the format of sweat, and it takes heat with it. That's one of the reasons when you're exercising in a dry climate, you don't feel nearly as uncomfortable as hot as if you're exercising outdoors in a humid environment. Because you don't have as much evaporative heat loss when it's a humid environment. You get really sweaty, but the sweat never leaves as evaporation. It sticks on your body. If you're cold, it's just the opposite, right? You're going to vasoconstrict, so you close down the blood vessels and you keep the temperature, the warm temperature in your core. So when you're cold, that's one of the reasons that your extremities are cold. Your hands are blue. Your feet are cold because you're trying to preserve the heat and keep it to the core. So you don't vasodilate, you actually vasoconstrict and you shunt the blood closer to the core. The second thing that you do is you initiate this shiver response. And the shivering is actually inefficient muscle contraction. And as you inefficiently contract muscles, it's, I don't know, this is an older movie, but, you know, do you guys ever remember the Karate Kid with the Mr. Miyagi?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Right? I mean, my brothers and I used to do this all the time, you know. Someone would, like, fall and break their arm and be like, ah! Right? No, seriously, dude, I call mom, okay? It's like, I got you, man. Right? We were not very sensitive to one another. But we're all still alive, so, you know, don't harm no foul. So that is heat transfer, right? Because it's inefficient, and we'll see this later in the semester. I'm foreshadowing some of the things we're going to talk about. You have two protein filaments that slide across each other when you contract muscles. That's why when you exercise, your muscles are warm, because there's frictional force there. So by shivering, you're creating heat, inefficient heat. Okay? Now, there's a little space over here so you can write this little factoid. These are the kinds of things that you only get if you show up. There's a third source of heat, but it's only available for infants. And then they lose it at about 12 to 18 months of age, and it's called brown fat. It's actually called thermogenic fat. This is adipose tissue, baby fat. It does exist. It is rich in mitochondria. It's rich in mitochondria, and it can produce ATP to help, not only does fat insulate the organism, but the brown fat that's thermogenically active with mitochondria, which are the powerhouse of the cell, right? They consume ATP, they produce ATP and create energy so that you actually can keep the organism warm. But by about 12, at least or at latest 18 months of age, the thermogenic fat converts to just regular old, you know, run-of-the-mill fat, like we all have. Nothing special about your fat now. Okay? So that's the third source. So shivering, vasoconstriction, and then in very young infants, thermogenically active fat known as brown fat. Okay, so let's answer this question because I kind of alluded to it. So here's a way that you're going to need to pull tidbits out of the lecture. Because I just about 3 minutes ago gave the answer to this in my lecture. Homeostatic regulation of the body is made possible through the coordination of all body systems. However, this coordination is controlled mainly by which? C. C. How many of you say C? Nice. Look at that. See, if it was a clicker exercise, it would kind of suck because everybody would win, right? Where's the fun in that when everyone gets a first place prize, right? C is correct, nervous and endocrine systems. And to your question earlier, I kind of alluded to this. So these are some of the things that you're going to have to pull out of the lecture. And we'll practice this throughout the semester. If we move on and we contrast this to positive feedback loops, we said, are they more rare? Yes. Are they less important? No. Are they more interesting? Well, maybe. We also said hemorrhage. And I said, well, some of the things of hemorrhage are negative feedback. Right? Bleeding's going to start. You want it to stop, so you clot the blood. But blood clotting in of itself is an example of a positive feedback system. Let me explain. When you activate blood through the coagulation cascade, there are 12 different factors that get triggered. Factor 1 goes to factor 1A. Factor 1A takes factor 2 to factor 2A. Factor 2A takes factor 3 to factor 3A. So on and so forth, all the way down this cascade. When you write it out, it looks like a waterfall chain of reactions. At the very bottom, you get factor 12 to factor 12A. Okay? So if you look at that, every time you activate a factor, you're stimulating a heightened response so that you clot the blood quickly. So blood clotting is a positive example of a positive feedback loop. It's a good example that helps us not to bleed out. So there's some other ones. The positive feedback loop, the response to the problem state is in the same direction or it's heightened. You increase the response. You're cold, I'm going to make you colder. That would be the example. That's not what's happening here, because temperature regulation is negative feedback loop. But positive feedback would be, you're going to start the coagulation of blood, I'm going to make it happen quicker. Orgasm is an example of a positive feedback loop. Kind of be lame if it was negative, right? So that one hopefully you won't forget. The menstrual cycle, many portions of the menstrual cycle are positive feedback loop in nature because one promotes the buildup of the next. Okay? So for example, estrogen levels in the female during the 28-day cycle actually stimulate progesterone receptors in the target tissue. And therefore those progesterone receptors become more prevalent and more likely to respond to the secondary sex hormone that's critical in the menstrual cycle, and that's progesterone. So that's an example of how this is a positive feedback where estrogen helps to stimulate the response of progesterone. It's receptor, but that's another strategy. Rather than upregulating progesterone, you upregulate the receptor so that you're more likely to respond to the levels of progesterone that you do have. So positive feedback examples would be blood clotting, the menstrual cycle, and orgasm. Now there's a negative one, or there's a example of a positive feedback system that has a deleterious effect. That's a better way to say it, so you don't get it mixed up. And that would be what we call a runaway fever. And clinically, this happens a lot in pediatric medicine, where there's a set point about 105 to 106 Fahrenheit, where now the organism triggers a continual increase in the temperature of the individual. And that would be considered what we would call a runaway fever.
That's fatal, though.
It can be fatal. If you get about 108, 109, then the brain starts to cook. And most oftentimes that individual kind of go into a sleep or a coma. And whether or not you can revive them or not, we don't know. You may not know. So a runaway fever is a deleterious example of a positive feedback system. But blood clotting, portions of the menstrual cycle, and orgasm would be significantly beneficial examples of positive feedback. All right. What I want to do is I want to transition into this atlas, and then we're going to move to the second lecture. Okay? So in lab this week, you're going to be characterizing different types of anatomical positions. And so we're going to define some of these. So there is a standard anatomical position that's important for us to know. And that's what this individual is doing here. That's standing in this position, in an erect position with your palms facing up. Okay, so if I complained of a right arm fracture, point to which arm we're talking about. This one. It's on your left side. Because you always refer to it in the patient's anatomical position. It's always the patient's perspective. Okay? So some of you are going to be needing to, when you're thinking on the exam or you're thinking on activities and we're talking about the right humerus, be like, right, you're going to have to do one of these to think about how do I look at that picture? So it's always the patient's perspective as you're looking at them and they're standing in this position. Okay? So some students think that right is left and left is right. It's just, I just remember that it looks backwards to me. Whatever helps you to keep that straight, just remember that it's not your right, it's the perspective of the patient that you're looking at when they're sitting or excuse me, when they're standing in anatomical position. So the positions here would be supine and prone with the hands. The way I remember that is holding a bowl of soup, and then you pour out the soup. To remember which one goes where. Okay? We also have ventral and dorsal. Now, ventral is your front side, also referred to as anterior. Dorsal is the posterior, or the back side, also referred to as posterior. So, ventral and anterior are used interchangeably. They're synonyms. And posterior and dorsal are used interchangeably. Why do we have two different sets of terms for the same thing? It goes back to a lot of neurophysiology. A lot of neurophysiology was looking at lower level vertebrates. And not everybody walks on two, not every creature, excuse me. Most of us all walk on two legs. But not every creature is bipedal. So if it's a four-legged organism or even an insect, you're going to have a dorsal side and a ventral side. Okay? The anterior-posterior is unique for humans. So like the dorsal fin on a shark is the posterior aspect. So for the most part, at least in my class, either will be correct. You're going to want to ask your lab instructor, do you prefer anterior-posterior? Do you prefer ventral versus dorsal? If I say ventral, will you mark me wrong because I didn't put anterior? I would ask now. For me, I don't care. And most of the time on the exam, I will put anterior, ventral in parentheses.
I was just going to ask if dorsal and ventral were more top and bottom, and posterior and anterior were more front and back.
Yes.
Okay.
Ventral and dorsal are more top-bottom orientation, and anterior-posterior are more front-back. But front-back is really mostly just for us. Like the dog, right? Your favorite family pet. Yeah, it would not be accurate to say anterior-posterior. Okay, so most of the vets would tell you, we use actually dorsal and ventral to talk about all of the animal kingdom except for Homo sapiens. I guess, Neanderthals and some of those others would be in the same category as us. So anterior-posterior would be kind of divided like this, which obviously doesn't really make sense in this particular organism. All right, we have superior and inferior. Superior means above, inferior means below. All right, so your head is superior to your waist. Then we have medial and lateral. Medial is down the midline, and lateral is going to be away from the midline. So, in the anatomical position, if you notice, the arms aren't straight down. They're actually out slightly. You're about shoulder width apart here, and your arms are out. So your wrist is actually lateral to your shoulder. Does that make sense? If it was above each other, you'd be standing like this. So your wrist is actually lateral to your shoulder. Or your shoulder is more medially placed than your wrist. Okay? And you'll go over a lot of these in lab as well, but this is so critically important because as you read and you move on in your field of study, when people in the literature talk, they actually use these terms. So you're starting to learn a foreign language, and that's why we're going over them. So does it seem elementary? Yes, but it's absolutely critical. And guess what? Students will miss them. And just don't make that you. Okay, proximal and distal. Oops, excuse me. Proximal and distal. Proximal is going to be closer to the center, right? And distal is going to be further away. So like, for example, in anatomical position, your feet would be your distal extremities, right? Or you could actually say that your wrist is actually distal from your shoulder. It's further away. Your shoulder is proximal, right, from the wrist. So there are numerous ways that you could actually say certain things, and those may be some of the areas where you actually have questions and you want to challenge certain things. Because both could be right. Superficial and deep. This is going to come into play in one of the first units we get to of the real stuff. We're in review after this atlas. We're going to talk about chemistry. and we'll talk about cell biology. All of this is review, but I want to make sure we're on the same page. And then we move into real stuff with histology and tissues, and we get into the skin. When we get into the skin, superficial and deep. Superficial is towards the surface, and deep is underneath the surface. So superficial would be like the skin is superficial to your bones. Your bones are actually deep to the skin. Make sense? We also have these anatomical planes. You can see them here. We have sagittal plane. Sagittal plane is going to cut the body into right and left sides. Sagittal, right and left sides. There are special cases of sagittal planes, like a mid-sagittal. A mid-sagittal cuts the body into right and left equal halves. But a parasagittal plane is off the midline. It still has a right side and a left side. They're just not equal. You with me? We usually refer to this when we're talking about imaging technology. Those of you that are going to be radiology techs, or you're going to look at x-rays or CAT scans or MRIs, you're going to slice the body in visual planes using imaging technology. And the physician may call and say, I want a mid-sagittal slice on this contrast CT. Well, don't take it here. Okay? They're going to be really irritated because maybe they want to actually see aspects of the aorta from top to bottom. Okay, they want mid-sagittal, and I want you to go, 5 centimeters parasagittally to the right and 5 centimeters parasagittally to the left. That's how they'll communicate to you. And if you don't know this language, you'll be like, I don't know what they're asking for. Okay, so that's how you would use this stuff. That's why it's important. If you look at the frontal plane comes down like this and separates the body into a front or an anterior and a posterior aspect. Frontal planes. Oops, sorry. There we go. All right. Another word to use to describe frontal planes are actually called coronal planes, depending upon what version of the textbook you have. And then one of the more common ones medically is actually the transverse plane, or what we call a horizontal slice, or a horizontal plane. So if you've ever had a CT done, or an MRI done, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll take these imaging slices through the body and they stack them. They stack them from top to bottom. Okay, so they go from superior to inferior, inferior to superior, and they reconstruct it, and they can look at any one particular transverse plane, and they can reconstruct it. Okay? So those are the different planes. Now, body cavities. We've got really two. We've got a dorsal body cavity and a ventral body cavity. The dorsal body cavity is towards the posterior aspect, and the ventral body cavity is towards the anterior aspect. The dorsal body cavity, by the scar, it involves the cranium and all the stuff inside the cranium, the brain stem, and the vertebral cavity, which houses the vertebral column. The ventral body cavity is towards the front aspect, the anterior aspect, and the diaphragm actually separates the ventral body cavity into the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic regions. And then in us, we actually have a structure known as the mediastinum that separates the thoracic cavity of the left side to the right side. So here's a great example of anatomical position, because the mediastinum that comes right down the middle is going to separate it from the left side, right? Correct? And the right side. So when you have a pneumothorax, does anybody know what a pneumothorax is? What is it?
Okay, sorry, I had one like 2 months ago.
Collapsed lung.
Collapsed lung. You had a collapsed lung?
Yeah.
Oh, bummer. Okay. So when you have an object that perforates the thoracic cavity, that air pressure actually puts pressure on the lungs, and lungs can't expand. So they collapse down. Fortunately, it's typically not fatal because it only collapses one side, one lung, or one left side versus the right side. It's very painful, but proof is you're not dead. See, look, it works.
Yeah.
The mediastinum is rather effective in keeping the left and the right side of the lungs unique. All right, moving on, membrane cavities. Well, we've got the meninges. We're going to talk more about these meninges later in the semester, but they line the brain and the spinal cord. These are membranes that are going to line stuff. The meninges line the brain and spinal cord. And we have three meningeal layers: the dura, the pia, and the arachnoid mater. And we'll get there later in the semester. We have other membranes that line different types of cavities, like serous membranes. Serous membranes don't have any opening to the outside environment. Well, neither do the meningeal layers, the previous slide. So the serous membranes, they typically have an inner layer and an outer layer. The inner layer we call as the visceral layer. The outer layer we call as the parietal layer. And then between the two layers is usually fluid. And the reason that you have these two moist membranes is you're going to have stuff sliding back and forth. That's why they're moist. And the fluid that's in there is a lubricious fluid. It's like oil. So the examples, again, back to the lung example, you actually have a visceral, the inner layer, and a parietal outer layer, because as the lungs inflate, the chest cavity gets bigger, and those two layers kind of slide across each other. As the lungs deflate and they come down, they slide again. So you have two layers, and you have a little bit of fluid in between that's viscous. It feels a little bit like oil, okay? So that there's not frictional problems going on there. The other place that we commonly see this, or we always see it, is around the heart. Now the heart actually beats at a greater rate than the lungs inflate typically and deflate. Your heart rate is faster than your respiratory rate. So the heart also, as it beats and contracts in this cavity, it has an inner and an outer layer around it, and in between those two layers is this fluid. Now I've never actually felt this fluid, but I have felt this fluid, and it feels exactly like motor oil. Like a really, really high quality motor oil. Not like a dark one, but one that's almost clear, okay? And if you rub it between two fingers, even with gloves, I mean, with gloves on, when you rub gloves, they're usually kind of tacky, okay? When you have pericardial fluid in there, it's super smooth. You do this all day long. Right? So these two cavities, never exposed to the outside environment, except in the example of the pneumothorax. And then we also see some examples down in the peritoneal cavity, down in the intestines. Right? Because we have a lot of motion that happens down here. You eat a hamburger, right? You have a tofu burger, just trying to play well here. And it moves through the digestive tract, and there's peristaltic motion of smooth muscle that contracts. And that needs to be done in a non-irritating way. Otherwise, you have a tummy ache. Okay? All right, so other membranes that line cavities that do open to the outside environment are called mucous membranes. Mucous membranes, because they're exposed to the outside elements, they actually need to be more strategically designed. They have a lot of enzymes in them. They may actually alter pH to make it inhospitable to bacteria or to viruses or to fungus. Some examples would be the mouth, the eyes, the nose, okay, the vagina. All of these are mucous membranes that open to the outside environment. Okay, so this ends our introductory lecture. And what I'm hoping is that you're tracking. It's fairly easy. The next segment is going to be easy as well, because it's review. And we're going to start it right now, chemistry. But it's going to pick up pretty quickly after cell biology, okay?